Francisco Cantu grew up along the border, and after college he took a job as a Border Patrol agent. The work weighed heavily on him and he eventually left. But the deportation of a friend caused him to reflect on his experiences, from his childhood in Big Bend National Park to his work along the border. Mr. Cantu recently came to New Mexico and stopped by to talk with our producer, Sarah Gustavus.
Francisco Cantu, thanks for stopping by New Mexico PBS.
Thank you so much for having me.
So in your book, The Line Becomes a River, you write that your mother didn't approve of you becoming a Border Patrol agent. You grew up with her along the border in the Southwest. What were her concerns?
I think, obviously, first and foremost, she was concerned for my safety, as any mother would be. But I think, beyond that, she was really concerned for the health of my soul. My mother spent her career working for the Park Service, and so she sort of had this experience of stepping into, this government institution, very idealistic, with a lot of ambition, and then sort of, had felt that be redirected and sort of stifled throughout her career. And I think she was also just worried about the violent nature of the job and worried about the ways that I would become numb and conditioned to that violence.
Did you believe her?
I was 22 when I made the decision to apply. I was 23 when I showed up at the academy. I had just finished college. I was extremely naive and sort of idealistic. I had studied immigration and border issues in college, and I had all of these big questions about policy, and I think probably a lot of the same questions that we're asking today. And I looked at the decision to join the Border Patrol as sort of an extension of my education. I wanted to connect the dots between the book learning that I had done and sort of the actual reality of the desert and of the landscape that I had been somewhat familiar with growing up. And so, yeah, I think my mom's fears ended up to be warranted. Those questions that I entered in with, very quickly faded away. I was sort of under the impression that I would, get all these insights and secrets and then, be able to leave and have all the answers for fixing border policy. But I really left with only more questions.
You mentioned you were 22 when you first decided to, apply for a job at the Border Patrol. When you entered and you met up with other people who had joined, they came from different backgrounds, different types of people. Do you think there are any defining characteristics or values that you saw in the people that were also agents?
The Border Patrol, I think a lot of people don't realize, is the largest law enforcement agency in the country. So I think, I'm not sure what the number's at right now, but there's around 16,000 agents. And that's more than there are DEA agents or FBI agents. So when you're talking about a group of people that big, you have, I encountered every kind of personality that you could really imagine. A lot of people, I think, don't realize that the Border Patrol is just under half Hispanic, Latino. A lot of the people that I went to the Border Patrol Academy with were from the border region. A lot of them were from, immigrant families. They were first, second generation. And so I think, for a lot of the people that were in the Border Patrol, the decision to take that job, it wasn't like my decision where I was like, oh, I want insight into this issue and I want to, get an education and have these experiences. I think for a lot of people, it's really just a simple decision of, if you're growing up in a rural community in the Southwest and you're looking around at the people who are doing well, the people who own their houses, who can provide for their families, who have a nice vehicle, a lot of times the people in those communities, they're law enforcement, or in a lot of border communities working for the cartel, or somehow affiliated with that. And so I think the decision is quite often a very simple one. It's a good job, it has good benefits, and for a lot of people, I think it's as simple as that.
Yeah. Did you talk with any other agents who experienced the same challenges emotionally in doing that work as you did?
I think it's important to note that in the Border Patrol, much like a lot of military and law enforcement jobs, there's not really a culture of talking about your feelings, or talking about the ways that the realities of that job might weigh on you. I think the job in many ways sort of causes one to bottle up, compassion and sort of set it aside. And I think, the job can cause people to internalize violence in all sorts of different ways. And it's very hard to find an outlet for that, I think, for a lot of people. So, even in my experience, I never talked to any of my coworkers about, these doubts or dreams or nightmares that I would have. And since writing this book, I've shared it with a couple of my former colleagues, and almost all of them had said, "Oh, I had no idea you were going through a hard time. I didn't know that the job was weighing on you in that way." And my response is always like, "Well, of course not. We don't talk about that."
Yeah, but you do describe in your book that you were having nightmares. When did you decide? What was the turning point for you when you decided you had to leave?
At the time, I don't think I would have told you that I was leaving because, the nightmares had gotten so bad and I couldn't handle it. I think, I had I had done all of these things to sort of like provide myself with a pathway out, one that could still feel like a way forward. But when I look back at it, there were a few moments when I sort of started to connect the dots. Like I said, and I never really grappled with these issues in my waking life, but I would have these recurring nightmares where people that I had apprehended would come back to me. I remember having a dream where I was surrounded by all these individuals with no face. I would dream of finding dead bodies. And there was another recurring dream that I had where my teeth would sort of crumble and fall out of my mouth, or where I would be clenching my jaws so tightly that my teeth would burst open in my mouth. And I went to the dentist after having had these dreams for a couple of years, and the dentist said, "Did you know that you grind your teeth in your sleep?" And I said, "No, I never had that problem before." And they said, "Well, you've ground through several layers of enamel in your molars." And so that was the first time that I was confronted with like actual real world manifestation of those nightmares. And that was a moment where I sort of had to look at myself and say, well, maybe you're not all right.
Your body's telling you. Yeah. So in the first part of your book, you talk about your experiences in the Border Patrol, and then you spend a good part of the latter part of the book talking about your friend Jose, who left, was undocumented, went to go see his mother when she was dying in Mexico, and then was apprehended coming back. And you tried to help him and help his family. How did the intersection of the two of those change how you saw this experience that you had as a Border Patrol agent?
Jose is a man that I sort of built a friendship with over the course of 2 years. Very, very casually, we worked together. He would share his breakfast with me every day. We slowly learned things about each other. He had lived in the United States for 30 years. He had 3 U.S. citizen boys who were all born in the United States. And I actually didn't know that he was undocumented. I don't think anyone at work knew. And then, all of a sudden, one day he wasn't at work. And, I asked what had happened to him, and I found out that his mother had died and that he had gone to be there for her funeral. And then after another 3 or 4 weeks, he still hadn't come back, and I began to ask what was going on, and that's when we found out that he was undocumented and that he had been apprehended trying to come back across the border. And because I was familiar with, these structures of, the deportation process, I was able to get in touch with his family and sort of figure out when he was going to appear in court and whether we could go and, connect them with an attorney and figure out how to visit him during prison visitation. And so that was the first time, because as a Border Patrol agent, you're really just out in the desert and in the field. For me, that was the first time that I had really looked behind the curtain at, the deportation industrial complex of America, which, even if you know that it exists and you're familiar with some of the structures, until you see someone have to navigate that system, and until you see the ways that it affects their family, I don't know, seeing that happen to someone I knew really changed me. And something else that was profound for me was seeing how, for his children who had never crossed a border, the border was suddenly thrust into their lives. It was brought to them, and it, absolutely ripped through their everyday reality. And I had been so hyper-focused in my studies and in my time as a Border Patrol agent on, the physical terrain of the border itself, the line in the sand, so to speak, that I had lost sight of that. And I think we quite often lose sight of that. The border extends so far beyond that terrain.
Absolutely. The border, the idea of the border is almost as important as the physical space that it's in. You mentioned that these stories of people stay with you and are really meaningful for you. Do you think politicians are hearing those stories? Is that having any impact for politicians who've never been here? There's something very different about living along the border, visiting the border, being in this space, meeting people in your day-to-day life. I know people here in Albuquerque, that are dealing with these things. And I wonder if politicians from the Northeast really get it, because they're not here.
I think that's true. I think we almost reject people's stories as anecdotes, and we're talking about a big issue here, and we almost consider stories as beside the point. But I think when you live in the border region, when you know people who are affected by all these issues, or when these issues affect you yourself, it completely changes the way that you think about policy conversation or these proposals coming out of DC. And I think probably many of your viewers might have encountered this in their lives, where for a lot of people who aren't from the Southwest or from the border region, when they talk about the border, it's this far away, abstract, almost forgettable terrain. It's like the ends of the earth. It's the last frontier of the nation. It's this terrain that can just be walled off and turned away from and forgotten about. But I think, for people who live along the border, you have the understanding of this place as one with its own distinct culture, a culture that predates the establishment of a border. And you see all of the day-to-day realities that the border brings into people's lives. So I think it's hugely important that we hear the voices and hear the stories of people who are most affected by the border. Because I think, people like Jose, they have more to tell us about the border and immigration than I do, than any policymaker does, any politician.
And so now you live in Tucson, but you also have visited many of these places where you spent time with your mother as a child, places, you know, in the Southwest. What's different for you now when you're not a Border Patrol agent anymore, but maybe you interact with Border Patrol agents, or you're in these places where you know there's activity going on along both sides of the border?
You know, the experiences I had as a Border Patrol agent still stay with me and still color the way that I see life in the borderlands. For example, any time that I drive, you know, on a highway or a freeway across the desert, and I'm within, you know, 40 or 50 miles of the border, when I look out at the landscape, you know, the same landscape that looks, you know, empty or desolate or devoid of life to a lot of people as they drive from one city to another. To me, what I think about is the certainty that there are people crossing that landscape, that there are people lost in that landscape, you know, without water. And so when I go camping out in the desert, I'm thinking of that. You know, I think I'll never be able to look at the landscape in quite the same way.
So right now, once again, immigration is this divisive issue in the country, and lots of people are talking about it. As someone who clearly loves language, and you're a writer, what are your thoughts on how we're talking about the words that we're using to speak about the border?
You know, I think the language that we use to talk about migrants is language that really dehumanizes and diminishes them and their condition. And I think we're so numb to a lot of this language that, you know, we use it without thinking. You know, we talk about a flood of migrants or an uptick in crossings as if migrants are, you know, a line on a graph. You know, we use these metaphors like talking about a cat and mouse game at the border. And I think what all these metaphors do is they sort of position the migrant as part of this indistinguishable mass of people. You know, one person is, you know, indistinct from the next. And I think that's really harmful. And I think it colors the sort of discussion that we have. You know, for example, last year, we heard many times about how border crossings were down. And they were at their lowest level in 14 years. But you know, what we didn't hear or talk about or amplify was the fact that, you know, the deaths along the border actually went up from the year before. So even though less people are crossing the desert, that crossing is more dangerous. And so I think, you know, we have to sort of reject that rhetoric that dehumanizes people. I think we have to think of these numbers and these statistics as each being representative of an individual life.
Thank you so much for stopping by, Francisco, and talking about your book and some of your experiences.
Thank you so much for having me.